Recently, a client who's become a good friend of mine asked me a set of questions that he wanted me to provide responses to, in part because he's genuinely interested in and also puzzled by these himself, and they're not easy questions. As a matter of fact, they're actually quite deep questions about the nature of philosophy itself as I understand it and as others understand it. And so here's the questions as they sort of developed out of this conversation. The first one is, what do I understand philosophy to be? And I very much appreciate the way that one was put. It's not quite as big of a question as what is philosophy in its essence or something like that. You know, by zeroing in on, well, what do you think philosophy is, that makes it a little bit easier, but, you know, it also gives you kind of a heavy burden that you have to meet, because you don't want it just to be this idiosyncratic, well, I think philosophy is this and that, and it doesn't look anything like what other people think in the field. I think that would be a bit self-indulgent. The second question, very closely related: what are we doing when we study philosophy? You know, and like the first question, sounds pretty simple to answer, but when you get down to it, not really that easy. Sort of like when Augustine in the Confessions famously says, you don't ask me what time is, I know exactly what it is, but you ask me about it and now suddenly I'm at a loss. This is that sort of question. And then the third one, which was a follow-up question, sort of specifying things a bit more, is a bit more, you could say, circumscribed and applied. What are the aims, or what are you trying to do or convey in an intro to philosophy course? But that one turns out to be a difficult question as well. So I'm going to discuss each of these questions in turn. Obviously, they interpenetrate each other for somebody like me, who does in fact teach a lot of introductory courses, both in academic settings and in open access, more public settings as well. So let's start with the first question. Actually, before we do that, I do want to say one other thing. So I mentioned that these are, surprisingly deep questions, difficult questions. And I think that it's, as I was reflecting on it, I was like, well, these should be easier for you, shouldn't they? Since you've been studying philosophy in academic ways since 1990 and you've been teaching for 25 years, you should have some pretty clear understanding. Whereas if you're going to ask somebody who's still in graduate school or a new professor, maybe it wouldn't be quite so easy for them. And yes and no. So, and I don't think this holds for everybody, right? So there are some people who they figure out their shtick and what they want to do, and they never really give a lot of thought to it after that. I'm not that kind of person in philosophy. In a way, it gets harder the more that you know, the more that you're exposed to, the more that you've seen. But hopefully you can provide better informed answers to these sorts of questions, even if there's a lot of hedging and saying, well, for the most part, and we don't really know. You should have, let's say, better contours to your answers. The other thing I'm going to point out too is that when we're asking questions about philosophy itself within the field of philosophy, we're engaging in something that, recently has come to be called metaphilosophical or metaphilosophy. And I think that's been there not necessarily from the very beginning in, pre-Socratic thinkers in the West, but it's already there by the time that we get to, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and these early thinkers. And it's been an integral part of philosophy. It's rare to find an important philosopher who isn't both doing philosophy and metaphilosophy at the same time, which means that there's multiple metaphilosophical positions out there, just as there are multiple philosophical positions. So, all right, that's enough like methodological stuff. Let's jump into the first question. What do I understand philosophy to be? And my answer is probably going to be unsatisfying to a lot of people who want me to point at something and say, that's philosophy, or, point out one of these books behind me. Here's where we begin with philosophy, because this is the essential thing. I, in the past, have seen a lot of different people putting forth stuff like that. And I actually have, quite a few like, what is philosophy or intro to philosophy books on these shelves, but they all give not completely different, but certainly differing answers. And I think that reflects something quite important. It's, philosophy as a term names a bunch of different and sometimes distinct, but also interconnected things or matters. And in the past, when I've talked about this in classes, and I also produced a video specifically about this for my Intro to Philosophy sequence, I talked about 4 main broad headings of things that could be connected with each other. So I don't think that we can say that philosophy is essentially one of these more than the others. And I think it would be kind of a mistake to try to do that. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. So in the broadest of terms, we can say that philosophy, when people are naming it and trying to point at it, they seem to have 4 main things in mind. One of them is thinking about it as a discipline or as an academic field. So you can go to a university and ask, where is the philosophy department? What you mean by that is not where do they teach philosophy, but where are the offices for the professors and the instructors who teach philosophy? Because philosophy will actually be taught in classrooms all over campus, right? Usually they locate you in whatever classroom happens to work. And this is the same in colleges as well. So, there are people in that field. Usually they have a PhD, sometimes just an MA in philosophy. There's like a progression of how this works. And, it's been done differently in different eras. So, in the past, you didn't always have to have a PhD. There could be another means of progression, but there'd be some way to show, okay, this person belongs in this field. But there were always other people coming in who didn't necessarily have the same education. They could have been autodidact, self-educated, just reading a lot of stuff and, smart enough to kind of put it together. Or they had a bit of, college or university education, but perhaps in another field, and they strayed over into philosophy. But in any case, there is a recognized academic field. But it's interesting because a lot of philosophy, a lot of things that developed within that field are often taught in other places, in political science and sociology and English and even mathematics, or, within the sciences, or communication studies or psychology. So that's one big thing. We can say philosophy is a discipline, We can also say philosophy is a literature. And, you see a good bit of it on the bookshelves behind me. But if you go into any major library, there's like shelf after shelf after shelf of philosophy stuff. Unfortunately, so in the Dewey Decimal System, where you've got the 100s are philosophy, you're going to find that there's a lot of occult and psychological stuff basically thrown in there, sometimes crowding out the actual philosophy stuff as well. But, there is a literature, and where exactly are the boundaries of it? Well, that depends on who you ask. So we'll come to that issue in a bit. But, the discipline and the literature, kind of go hand in hand, don't they? Because a lot of what you do in that discipline is engaging with at least a portion of that literature. And in the course of the people in the discipline doing what they do, they produce more literature. So, for example, when I was a graduate student in analytic philosophy, one of the really, really big things that was going on was the David Lewis possible world semantic stuff for understanding necessity and possibility and impossibility. And it started to get spiraling off into getting used for all sorts of other things in metaphysics, even in ethics, interestingly. And, that was a new contribution to literature, right? To the philosophical literature. At one point in time, Kant's critiques hadn't been written. At another point in time, Aristotle's works weren't available because he hadn't even been born, right? So the literature is getting added to, and no person has an encyclopedic grasp of all the available philosophical literature. We're always kind of picking and choosing. And that's a topic for another time. So we've got discipline, we've got literature. What else? We can say that philosophy is also an activity. Philosophizing, when it doesn't just mean sitting around and BSing, getting high or drunk and talking about ideas with people that you think are cool. But when there's actually some drive to it, some rigor to make some progress in important areas of that field, like ethics, figuring out what's right and wrong, or epistemology. Who can we trust? Who is not trustworthy, and why? And can we really know that sort of stuff? We could go on and on. So philosophy isn't just something that is within the domain of the experts, the acknowledged experts, or in the books. It's something that people do. And that's how you get the books. That's how you get the experts, right? And it's part of what those experts do, but it's not restricted just to them. Ordinary people throughout all time have been engaging in philosophizing, sometimes not even knowing that they were doing that. So now we've got three things that are interconnected, right? Activity, literature, and discipline. There's a fourth one, I think, at least, and that would be what we could call vocation. And when I use that term, you could think of also in terms of way of life or something that you find valuable, worth prioritizing in the scope of your existence. And I think that that is something distinct, right? But it feeds into these others. So what does it mean to have a philosophical vocation, or which could happen, by the way, at any point in your life? It doesn't have to happen when you're, young and going to college, and then you decide, I want to be a college professor, so I'm going to go on and get my PhD. I mean, it could happen in your 70s, that you suddenly have, time on your hands and you discover how cool philosophy is and you want to study it. It happens for quite a few people. Some other people, I have a client in mind who's around my age, studied philosophy as an undergraduate, wound up building a really successful business, decided in his late 40s, I want to study philosophy again. And that's how he and I got connected. another client who subsequently became a friend. So I think that these four things are all philosophy, right? And we don't want to leave any of them out. We don't want to say, well, it's only the activity that really matters. The literature, that's just derivative products. Because, a lot of your activity is actually engaging with what other people have had to say. If you think you're going to invent it all yourself out of your head, well, there's lots of people who've tried that and it always fails, right? So, if you think you're going to totally ignore the academic philosophers and the way they do things, not a good thing to do either. But you don't want to just say, well, it's whoever happens to be in charge of the discipline. Well, that's not it either. These four are all mutually supporting, I would say, and we want to give attention to each of them. There's more diversity or plurality within philosophy in two other very important ways. So one of them is that if we look at the landscape of philosophy, even if we just look at it in the present, which I think is a bad idea, but there's a lot of people who do this. So here in America, there's a tendency to say, oh, there's two main schools or kinds. There's analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. There's a divide between them. And, analytic philosophy comes from the Anglo-American tradition, and continental philosophy is from Europe, so French and German and maybe some, other thinkers. That is really parochial because it doesn't even take into account, what was done here in America prior to analytic philosophy getting a stranglehold in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and onward. There was something we call classical American philosophy, which doesn't include just one school. It's not just pragmatism. It also includes the transcendentalists. It includes Jonathan Edwards. It includes what's called the American Renaissance. It includes all sorts of interesting stuff. American idealists, St. Louis Hegelians, Josiah Royce. We could talk about comparative philosophy, where you're deliberately setting up, comparisons between Western philosophy and non-Western philosophy. There's all sorts of vast traditions of non-Western philosophy coming from the Indian cultural sphere and the Dharmic religions/philosophies, the Chinese or East Asian cultural sphere, and from other places as well. And we can talk about a number of other things, going back. We can use MacIntyre's term tradition-constituted rationality, which he sees in the Aristotelian and Thomist traditions. So there's lots and lots of different ways of doing philosophy in the present, and there have been lots of them in the past. And no one single one of those ever cornered the market on being philosophy. Interestingly, many of them had the ambition of doing so. This is a very common preoccupation in modern philosophy. It's something you see Hobbes explicitly talking about doing in Leviathan. Descartes talks about doing this. Locke tries to do this with his essay. The German idealists were all into this sort of thing. But nobody ever succeeds. Nobody ever does get it all, and they're the one way of doing philosophy going forward. So, we probably want to be attentive to multiple, whatever you want to call them, traditions, schools, styles, approaches, methodologies. The other thing that I do want to say too is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that philosophy often gets done outside of philosophy departments. So there are no real dividing lines universally recognized between philosophy and other disciplines, in part because it's not just philosophy that has a diversity of ways of doing it. Plenty of the other disciplines do too. There's no one single way of doing sociology or psychology, let alone theology or history, or there's lots of different schools, lots of different methodologies, lots of different approaches. Some of them may be more philosophically informed. Some of them may draw explicitly on a particular philosophy. Some of them may inform philosophy. And so we got to be really, really careful when people are like, philosophy begins here, and if you cross this line, you're in the theology. Well, it depends on which perspective you take. And you can still say, too, is that distinction that you're making a theological one or philosophical one? And that varies as well. I do want to say that there are a couple dangers when we're trying to define philosophy, and we never do succeed in defining it. One of these is, we could call it the danger of exclusivity. Only this really counts as philosophy. Everything else is kind of not as good. It's pseudo-philosophical. It's not really philosophy in its true sense. Lots of people have put that sort of thing forward. None of them ultimately hold up to scrutiny. They're all based on some sort of arbitrary assumptions and judgments. The other thing I want to say is where people do get themselves messed up some of the time is they want to use philosophy and philosopher as what we call success terms. So imagine if you went to law school and you passed the bar and you went to court, but you lost every single case that you litigated in court. Somebody might come along and say, oh, well, you're not really a lawyer, are you? And you can say, but I've passed the bar. I've gone through law school. I am in the court. I'm being recognized. And they can say, yeah, but when it comes down to it, what you're doing isn't really law and you're not really a lawyer. Well, what they're doing there is substituting you're not a very good or effective lawyer for being a lawyer per se. By the way, there's some people in philosophy who do this. You can find arguments like that in Plato's Republic, Book 1. Plato pulls that trick at a number of different points. Usually Socrates is talking to somebody who doesn't realize that that's a bad inference, right? So there's plenty of people out there who are not great philosophers, but they might be okay, and that doesn't keep them from being philosophers. Or, it may not be philosophy in a book exactly the way that you think of philosophy, but it could still be philosophy depending on, whether people are doing the things that we typically associate with philosophy, like, making claims and trying to provide some argument or evidence or reason to buy into it, taking into account what other positions on it might be, hopefully appealing to things that all, or at least most of us can take in and think about on our own, right? So not everybody's doing great philosophy. As a matter of fact, not everybody could possibly be doing great philosophy at any given point in time, right? Just like writing great literature, making great TV shows, or great music. It doesn't work like that, right? So these are, I think, a lot of moving parts to this question, what do I understand philosophy to be? So to bring it to a close, I'll say, what do I understand philosophy to be? Well, it's all of these different things connected up with each other, and there's no one single node in the network that you can zero in on and say, aha, this is it. Although philosophy teaches us to look for those kinds of essences or definitions or nodes, but it really can't provide one for itself. So that takes care, I hope, of the first question. Let's talk about the second question. What are we doing when we study philosophy? And I think you're also, a lot of people are going to find this unsatisfying for me to begin by saying, well, lots of different things. There's no one single right answer to this one either. There are multiple good answers to it, I would say. And the first thing I do want to point out is answering this is something that is inevitably going to depend on and perhaps reveal to us, so there might be some usefulness in thinking about this, preconceived ideas, which maybe we came up with on our own or we got from somebody else, and our motivations for study and the style or method that we're adopting when we study. So let's start with the last one first. So, and we'll talk about this distinction between, broadly speaking, because it's not as if there's an essence of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. But one thing that you can say is that on the whole, people who have been brought up in analytic philosophy, they do read texts, but they don't typically read more than small portions of them, and they don't read them quite often as attentively or carefully as they ought to. Continental oriented philosophers are often not just, very focused on texts, but sometimes a little precious in how much they want to linger over certain passages of the text. Neither one is necessarily better than the other, but those are both going to influence you when you're asking, well, what are we doing when we study philosophy? So, if you're reading St. Anselm, I'll give you a prime example of this. I had a colleague who was writing, he's an analytic philosopher, he does work on, free will and determinism, and he'd posted something in Facebook and said, here's what I have to say about this. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because, St. Anselm talks about that in his De Libertate. And he was like, well, which passage? And I was like, buddy, just read the whole text. And he's like, oh, I don't want to read the whole text. And I was like, don't be lazy. It's, very, very short. We're not talking about a big, thick book. You can read the whole text. And I wouldn't give him like the specific passage because I didn't want him to be intellectually lazy. And he kind of did, so that's sort of a prime example. But you could have this, I only want the parts that matter attitude, being a Thomist philosopher. That's one of the problems with some contemporary Thomists. It gets like doubly so when you got analytic Thomists. And then you could have similar preoccupations with the continental philosophers. Ooh, I want to, unpack this particular concept of alterity and the other, and, how it's connected with hermeneutics of the self and all. And you're like, you don't need to bring all that to the table necessarily to read Seneca or to read Rene Descartes, right? Maybe you just actually check out the texts and see what they have to say about philosophy. That could be kind of useful sometimes. And so here's actually something I'll point out. Sometimes, I mentioned philosophers will often have a metaphilosophy within their philosophical works. You can read somebody like Descartes, and Descartes will give you some advice about how to read philosophy. Similarly with Kant, and it'll be different advice. Or with Hegel. Not necessarily easy advice to ferret out or follow. But that's an important thing, the methodology that we pick. What are our motivations for studying? Do we primarily want to read philosophy in order to figure out, what's wrong with us and how we got to where we are, where we're not particularly happy, and we've got some good relationships and some that are not so good, and we can look at our characters and be like, I need some work. Well, that's one very interesting motivation, and a great motivation, by the way. Are we trying to achieve an understanding of the totality of the universe and human beings and acquire wisdom in some sort of, global sense? Well, that's a different kind of motivation. Are we trying to impress people? That's one reason why I think a lot of people study philosophy, win debates, and, show people how smart we are. Well, that's a different motivation, right? So our motivation is going to matter quite a bit, when it comes to what are we doing when we study philosophy. And then preconceptions. What do we think philosophy is? If we have a very narrow, restrictive notion of it, then we're doing something different in studying philosophy than somebody who's much more omnivorous intellectually and is trying to make connections. I will say that oftentimes philosophy does, and this is, philosophy is literature, as we pointed out, it does involve engagement with texts by particular authors. So, we read Plato. You can read pre-digested Plato in secondary literature or sources like Spark Notes, but that's not the same thing as studying Plato as such, right? And you won't get necessarily the same benefits or engagements by doing so. You can read somebody else on Nietzsche rather than doing the work of trying to read through Nietzsche, but it won't be as rewarding. So, we do study texts, and that often means getting to figure out what somebody means by their terms. Going to the dictionary for definition is often not just unhelpful, but counterproductive when it comes to philosophy, because philosophers aren't always using words in exactly the same way as non-philosophers are in their works. And we're looking in their texts for what it is that they have to say. What are the perspectives that they're providing us with? And this does involve looking at, the claims that they're making. They're not just describing, tableaus or things like that, or characters in a novel. They're saying, hey, things are like this, not like this. And they will give arguments for that, provide evidence, some sort of reasoning, some sort of explanations. They'll also often critically engage with other perspectives and say, here's my perspective, here's another set of perspectives that differ from mine. Here's why I think that they're inadequate or even wrong, and why my perspective is better. So that's part of what we're looking for when we're studying. And I like this analogy, and I think there's really something to this. When we're reading a philosopher and we're working on a text that they have, there's an entire scaffold of ideas within that text in language. And part of what we're doing is we are reconstructing that scaffold of ideas, not exactly in the same form that they have it, because we're not just copying machines, but we're constructing something analogous to it in our own mind. And so this is, more difficult with some philosophers than others. When I was taking my preliminary examination, my special thinker examination, before I worked on my dissertation on Hegel, I was told to store up in my mind the structures of all the dialectics of the phenomenology of spirit. And I actually made myself a gigantic map of that so that I could try to keep all of this stuff in my head. And that was probably the closest I ever came to seeing, the phenomenology as a totality system, because, now I concentrate on particular parts of it. But that's what we do. And, so when I'm studying Stoicism, I am reading Seneca or Epictetus or Musonius Rufus, and I've got this whole apparatus of ideas stored away in my head from numerous readings of these, and it's slowly built, right? And it overlaps to some degree with the Platonist ideas or with the Aristotelian ideas, so you can have multiple maps in your head. And sometimes they will indeed overlap to some degree. Sometimes they'll be, jarring with each other. So you probably can't have too many of these at any given time. I think that another answer that we can give to this, what are we doing when we study philosophy? We could think about how we do it in relation to other people. Because you don't study philosophy totally on your own, retreating into Descartes' stove-heated room, wiping everything away. I mean, Descartes, that's a story that he tells, but that's not really how it worked. And you notice that he's engaged with all sorts of other people. So, sometimes understandably, there's a relationship of like teacher to student, particularly when we're starting out. We might look at the way that we relate to some of these authors as similar to that, at least for a while. Could also be collaborative, where think about like reading groups. People decide we're going to read a text together. Like, we had texts when I was a grad student that weren't getting taught in our curriculum, so we would just form reading groups. Or we actually did reading groups also on Hegel's phenomenology, spending an entire year on it. So that's more like on a peer level. And we academics do that. We go to conferences and we present our ideas to other people. Here's what's going on in Aristotle. And then other Aristotle scholars are like, well, I think you got that partly right, but have you considered this text here, right? It could be agonistic. Some ways of doing philosophy are much more about competitiveness and trying to show the other person's got it wrong. And that's not necessarily bad. It can become bad when it leads to rivalry and tearing each other down more than constructing things. But it can serve a vital purpose. And I think, sometimes philosophy is just happening through dialogue and conversation. And that can be with living people. And nowadays we can do it not just face-to-face or with telephones, but virtually across continents, through video and audio and all sorts of other cool things as well. You could do it in a Slack or Discord or pick whatever else you like, right? So those are all important things to keep in mind about, well, what are we doing when we study philosophy? Some of our studying philosophy is not just studying philosophy by ourselves, it's studying it with others. And I think that's a good thing because we are social creatures. Another thing that I think is really important for some people, and it's always been important for me, although sometimes more and sometimes less, is philosophy is something that, at least certain kinds of it, can and should be applied to life. Because that's what a lot of philosophy is about, is like how to understand human existence and to make it less screwed up, whether in terms of society or in terms of knowledge or in terms of moral development and relationships and all of those sorts of things. So even if it's just like in imagination, like you read Schopenhauer and you're like, well, man, if this was true, then would this change the way that I make my decisions and prioritize things? Or would my life be just the same if the reality of things is a primal will and I'm just, ultimately a little lowercase w will who's never truly going to be happy? Well, I mean, if you read Schopenhauer and you understand him and you do think he's got some things right, you probably should change your life, right? Same thing for if you think Seneca's got things right, or Cicero, or Plutarch, or René Descartes, or pick whoever else you want to talk about. So I think that's an important part of it. And I think that another thing that we do want to say is that not only is there no single blueprint for what is it that we do when we're studying philosophy, we can say that it is something that's extended over time and can be something that grows over time. It's iterative, it's cumulative. That doesn't mean that you just level up or stuff like that. All the video game analogies are usually very counterproductive when it comes to philosophy, right? Instead, like I said, you build up these networks of ideas in your mind, and you do that bit by bit, piece by piece. It gets more complex. It gets better. Every once in a while, the stuff doesn't stick and it falls out of your head, and you got to put it back in there through studying again. By the way, that idea goes all the way back to Plato's Symposium, where they talk about that, right? And there's different ways of doing this. You could be very deliberate and methodical in how you plan stuff. You could also just kind of pick books at random and read them and slowly piece together something. It could be motivated by particular research projects or things that you're, really interested in working on. Prime example for me, why do I know so much about ancient and medieval philosophers on anger? I have anger problems and I needed to get a handle on them. And I was finding that psychological therapy was not helping me enough. So I turned to philosophy and found that there's a whole treasure trove of that kind of stuff in these texts, if you know where to look for it. That's a motivation, right? So I think, again, as with the first question, all of this feeds into the answer that I'm providing, a very complicated answer to this second question, but one that I hope will be helpful for people, if only for spurring reflections of your own in thinking about what it is you want to do when you're studying philosophy. What do you want to get out of it? So that brings us to the third and more seemingly easy, more applied question, which might be a bit of an illusion. What are my aims, or what am I trying to convey in an intro to philosophy course? So the first thing I want to say is that those are some of the hardest courses to set up and teach. Why? Well, two reasons. One has to do with the sort of level of preparedness of the students that you're getting. So here in America, a few students may have had philosophy in high school, generally taught as a religion elective in religious schools, or as an English or history or social science elective in public schools. But most of your class, when you teach an intro class, have no background in philosophy at all. They've heard the word, they have no clue what it means, and all they know is it's supposed to be difficult, so some of them have anxiety coming into the class. And oftentimes, these are first semester freshmen. They're not philosophy majors. They've already declared to be accounting majors or biochem majors or nursing or psychology or communication. Every once in a while, you'll have a philosophy major in your class. That's pretty rare, right? So that makes it kind of difficult, in part because you have to do a lot of leading them into the texts that you're going to have them look at, which you wouldn't have to do. Teaching graduate students, easy as pie, right? They're super motivated. They've already got a background. You just point them in the right direction. You're like, go check out that stuff and come into class and do some presentations. Even upper level philosophy classes for majors are way, way easier than teaching intro to philosophy or, things like critical thinking or ethics or, other what we call service classes. So, there's both of those things going on. But the other thing that makes it really difficult is that it's tempting to try to do too much in an intro class because it's an intro to philosophy. And philosophy is this gigantic, vast literature, discipline, activity, vocation. As we pointed out, which things should you focus on? It is, if you're familiar with the word triage, comes from hospital stuff, but it's used in all sorts of other contexts as well. So if you have an emergency room, you deal with the patients who are, the worst off, but have prospects for staying alive first, and then you like put off the others till later. So if somebody comes in because they need some aspirin, they're probably not going to get to the emergency room unless it's really, a light day or something like that. Well, with philosophy, you get 15 weeks for a semester here in the United States. And you're probably actually not going to get 15. You're going to get closer to 14 or 13, depending on when breaks fall. And, the first day you got to like go over the syllabus anyway and expectations. You got to have some like testing days or activity days. So you're not going to get that much time. Who and what are you going to teach? How are you possibly going to do an introduction to philosophy in that short a time? It's tough to do even with other more narrowly circumscribed disciplines, right? You're like, well, we're just going to do ancient philosophy. You can't even do all of ancient philosophy or even a representative sample of it in 15 weeks. Or we're just going to do metaphysics. You can't do enough of that in 15 weeks. But if it's intro and it's a very general thing, it's so much tougher to do. So it's like a total triage for beginners. And so, this should actually make us say, maybe we got to set the bar kind of low, don't have really super high expectations. My intro class doesn't have to be the be all and end all. That would be the best possible intro class for anyone to take. I've fallen into the trap of trying to make it that, and it never really comes across. So what I do is I actually have my students read primary texts by important philosophical thinkers, usually available in the public domain, right? So we can get the text for free, although they're usually in older translations. And, there's some Plato, there's some Aristotle, there's some Descartes, there's some Hume. I usually like to also do some Thomas Aquinas, some Augustine, some Cicero. With Cicero, we get the Stoics and the Epicureans and his own perspective on things. Some Seneca, typically, not least because Seneca in some of his letters talks about Plato and Aristotle, so it's a good way of connecting things together. If there's time, I do St. Anselm. I like to do Mary Wollstonecraft and, wrap up the semester with a little bit of Sartre and a little bit of de Beauvoir so they get some existentialist philosophy. You notice there's some pretty big gaps in there. I don't try to be completely representative. Even when it comes to like thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, who we're doing for several weeks, we're only doing portions of their work. Like with Aristotle, I typically do Metaphysics Book 1 and portions of the Nicomachean Ethics. On one day we'll do books 1 and 2. We do the various virtues found in 3 and 4 on another day. And then we'll usually either do the stuff about friendship in book 8 and 9, or we'll do the stuff about moral responsibility in books 3 and 7. So you notice we're skipping a lot of stuff even there. And part of what I'm doing is trying to give them, some highlights without saying these are the absolutely most important texts that any educated person must read. I'm like, listen, there's lots of stuff we could be reading besides this, but here's what we're doing this semester. And sometimes I've changed it up a bit. Like I've focused the class sometimes on love and friendship, in which case, obviously we do Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics books 8 and 9, but we also do like Cicero's, on friendship and some other things, including the letters between Eloise and Abelard from the Middle Ages, right? And René Descartes' discussions in the Passions of the Soul and his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth. But sometimes I do change it up. But typically, I'm picking some texts that I think will be helpful for the students because they're representative. These are important authors. I tie them very closely to the academic fields that we're studying and the topics. So I'll be like, listen, Today, we're talking about ethics and also about metaphysics, the metaphysics of the human person, because we're looking at what Plato thinks a good person is. So we got to look at this psychology with the three parts of the soul and how they connect up with each other and whether there's an analogy to political life or anything like that. And then, they can wrap their head around it and they've got some sense of, well, why are we studying this stuff? We also are going to, as best as we can, we're going to compare and contrast the different positions to each other. So I like there to be continuity. Plato said this, but Aristotle says this. Which do we think is right? We engage in some critique of them. We look for the arguments or accounts or explanations that are being given. Sometimes I'll put them up on the board. Sometimes they're represented in handouts. We want to see whether we buy them. And we don't it's not an on-off switch where we're like, if there's any flaw in the argument, it's all crap and we throw it away. We want to wean them away from that black and white off-on sort of thinking and say, so we don't buy into everything that Seneca is saying. What parts do we think are valuable? Why? And what parts do we think he's got wrong? And why? And very, very important from my perspective and from my students, and I think this is why they get so much out of my class, I use lots of examples, very often drawn from contemporary life, as well as the examples that the philosophers will provide. We draw analogies between things, and we look for how we would apply the ideas to our own actual lives, experiences, relationships. As a matter of fact, one of the kind of assignments that I use most frequently requires them to explain a key concept and then to talk about how it actually applies or would apply within the scope of their own life. And they find that quite useful. So, that's something that we're doing in class, in assignments. Another thing I try to do, and I think I do succeed in this, is to convey my own passion and interest and value of philosophy, but also of non-philosophers who are going to engage in philosophy. And by that I mean my students and their coworkers and the other people working in the university who they're going to encounter when they go to have lunch after class, or they see cleaning up the campus, or, whoever else, and their parents, and their, boyfriends, girlfriends, significant others, whatever, right? I want them to get not only that, philosophy is worth studying and taking seriously and digging into, but that people matter and people's lives can be improved by philosophy. And when they see that you're serious about that, you're not condescending to them, you're not like, you business majors, you live a deficient sort of life. If we're looking at whether wealth really is a genuine good, a topic that we talk about in Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, in Thomas Aquinas, well, we gotta take it seriously. The fact that some people do think it is a genuine good, and what's their mindset? What is it they're actually after with that? And that's something that can be quite exciting to discuss. So I'm hoping to awaken something in them. I don't really like the metaphor of planting the seed. I prefer to think about it as giving them the right direction and tools that later on maybe they'll start using more often. And, I think that doing this, it never fully works out. I'll say that too. It's difficult to teach an intro class well. It's not insurmountable, but it's difficult. And, I tell my students that. And I also tell them, hey, philosophy itself is difficult. You're going to run into things that are going to challenge you. You're not going to understand everything. That's okay, because you will work at it and you will grow and develop. And that is normal. That is part of the process. If you were to like read a book, in philosophy the first time and get everything, and you came to me and you said that, I'd be like, no, you didn't. You think you did, but you didn't. Wait till you read it another 5 times and you see how many things you missed in the previous readings. How do I know that's the case? Because I'm a pretty smart guy and I was, very talented when I was doing it. And I kind of had that idea when I was, first starting out. And I'm still finding stuff in books that I've been reading now for 30 years where I'm like, holy crap, I missed that connection. Right? So, it is, I try to convey to them that it's not like other classes where you got it, you get yourself 100 because you figured everything out. No, it's a continual process. And so I'm trying to introduce them to something. And the last thing I'll say about that is, there's a tendency, big tendency among philosophers to portray ourselves as a kind of elite, right? And, in a certain sense, and by the way, that's built into philosophy, right? That's there in Plato, that's in Aristotle, hell, that's there in Heraclitus and Parmenides. There is something to that, although there's other disciplines where people are doing brilliant things as well that often do feed into philosophy. But we do want them to think about this. It is an elite, people who study philosophy, because philosophy will, if you're studying it, sort of in the right way, it will, pay off in great dividends for your intellectual and practical life. But on the other hand, it's also kind of equal opportunity. Anybody who wants to can study philosophy. You don't have to go to some fancy school and study with the big name professor who wrote a lot of books. Hell, if that was the case, I wouldn't be doing good philosophy because I didn't do that. I went to just some random place that I picked where the professors kind of didn't care, and I read the books in the library and they gave me enough direction to do what I was going to do. And then I went to grad school and I just went to the first place that gave me some money, not thinking about rankings or anything like that. It so happened that they had a great research library, and I, got to study with some people who weren't, the biggest scholars in their field, but were the right people at the right time for me. And, there's lots and lots of ways into philosophy. Think of it as a house, not just with one entry point, but with tons and tons of doorways that you can go into, with many, many rooms and corridors that you can explore. Or if you like a city, something even bigger, where you don't even have to know the whole city to be a resident there, and find parts of it that you are familiar with but would still like to explore more. So on the one hand, philosophy can be an elite activity, but it's an elite that anybody who's sufficiently motivated can actually join and participate in. And, we should be a little bit distrustful of those who want to gatekeep and, restrict and say, well, that's not really philosophy. Not that anything goes. We don't have to be super loosey-goosey about it. But there's a lot of different ways of doing philosophy. So this may be a video, as I mentioned, that could be unsatisfactory for some people, because I've given a lot of, well, it depends, and, what is this? And I say, well, it's about 4 or 5 different things, and here's some considerations. But hopefully, it helps people out. And it certainly is the way I've come to think about things. So you could say that, as far as a personal metaphilosophy, this is an articulation of it. So I'm very grateful to my client and friend for commissioning this video and asking me these great questions, for which I don't have super great answers, but hopefully answers that are at least partly satisfactory or at least thought-provoking for others.